Good evening. I'm Max McCombs. This is my colleague, Craig Carroll. We're delighted to be here this evening to talk to you about agenda setting as applied to organizations, and also briefly some of the new theoretical developments in agenda setting. Since it's perhaps been a few years since some of you were in school and passed the exam on agenda setting, I'll start with just a few introductory remarks about how this theory has evolved, because we're now celebrating the 45th anniversary of agenda setting theory. It was in the fall of 1968, 45 years ago, that the first study of first formal study of agenda setting was done, the Chapel Hill study that launched the field of agenda setting. Since that very tightly focused study on agenda effects or media effects in Chapel Hill, agenda setting theory has evolved into a multifaceted theory encompassing 5 primary areas, and today I will introduce to you a new area that is becoming the 6th aspect of the theory. The Chapel Hill theory, which we now refer to as demonstrating basic agenda setting effects, the focus there was on an agenda of issues. And the core hypothesis was that issues that are prominent in the news coverage over a period of time become prominent in the public mind, that the public comes to perceive those issues as the most important issues of the day. That has been expanded, obviously, beyond the idea of an agenda of issues, and now in very abstract terms, we talk about an agenda of objects, and here I'm using the term object in the way, for instance, that social psychologists use the term attitude object. The attitude objects, whatever the thing is you have an opinion or attitude about. It could certainly be a public issue, but it could also be a public figure. It could be an organization, a political party, a corporation. It could be whatever object or set of objects that you're interested in. So what we now refer to as basic agenda setting effects, or sometimes it's called first level agenda setting effects, was the beginning of the theory. But you will still find basic agenda setting effect research because, of course, there are a great many new channels of communication in existence today as compared to 1968. And one of the questions that people continually seek an answer to, do these new channels of communication have agenda setting effects? Does Facebook, Twitter, online news, do these have the same kinds of effects that the traditional news media had? I'll give you the quick Cliff Notes answer to that question for the exam. Yes, they do. Moving to the what we now call the second level of agenda setting, which was introduced in 2 studies in the 1970s in the United States. If we think of this first level agenda as composed of objects, then it makes it very easy to think about the second level, because objects have attributes. They have characteristics. When the media talk about an object, whether it's an issue, a person, an organization, or whatever, they describe it in some fashion. They say it possesses certain attributes. For a political figure, it often will be, what is the political ideology of this person? But it might also be, what is the experience and background of this person? It might be the personality and style of this person. That is, there can be any number of attributes. And just as we can think of an agenda of objects, for each object on the agenda, there is an agenda of attributes. Some attributes are mentioned more frequently in the media than others. Some are not mentioned at all. So the media has an agenda of attributes, and then the research in that area began to explore the extent to which you could also have attribute agenda setting effects. That is, the attributes emphasized in the media became, in the minds of the public, the most important attributes of that object. The question that we devised in the 1970s to measure the public agenda of attributes seems to work quite well around the world and is still widely used today. The question goes something like this. It's an open-ended question. Suppose you had a friend who had been away for a long time and knew nothing about Barack Obama. What would you tell them? It doesn't push you in any particular direction. As I said, some people would describe Barack Obama in terms of his political ideology. Some people would describe his personality. People would describe him in various ways. Particularly for political figures, you sometimes get pure affect, and it's nearly always at the extremes. You know, this person is destined for sainthood, or this person is going in precisely the opposite direction. So you can get a variety of descriptions of persons, also of issues, of other objects, and you can match the public's agenda of attributes to the media's agenda of attributes. And again, we find very, very striking levels of correspondence between the two. A little later this evening, I'm going to talk about, so that's the first and second level. A little later this evening, I'm going to talk about a new third level of agenda setting effects, but we'll leave that for a few minutes from now. Quickly, the other three areas that have emerged is, one, some psychological explanation for why these effects occur. And if you've studied agenda setting, you're undoubtedly familiar with the concept introduced by David Weaver in our 1972 study, need for orientation. The extent to which people feel a need for orientation, say, toward the issues in a political campaign, or knowing something about the candidates, or need for orientation toward other objects, the stronger the agenda setting effects are going to be. So it ties into a need for understanding. There's also some very recent work in that area, and that's a whole different lecture. You won't have to listen to that this evening. Once we had established these first and second level effects, and we knew something about their psychology, then there were questions at either end of the agenda setting sequence. On the continuing forward, it said, well, it's I call it the journalistic question. Okay, the media have first level effects, they have second level effects, so what? What does this mean? Well, research over the last about 15 years now has mapped out the effects that these on attitudes and opinions, the impact on attitudes and opinions of these first and second level effects. A somewhat ironic development of the theory, because of course when we first began agenda setting research, the conventional wisdom of the day, particularly among academics, was the media do not have effects. And that was particularly because 20 years of communication research had looked at the impact on attitudes and opinions and found very little impact. Now, because agenda setting is focused on very specific elements of the media agenda, we find that there are indeed consequences for attitudes and opinions. And the last area, which actually goes back to the 1980s now, people began to accept the idea there are agenda setting effects, and they raised the question, who sets the media's agenda? That is, if the media sets the public's agenda, where did this media agenda come from? And this is really an extension of the field of sociology of news that also goes back many, many years in communication research. And there are any number of influences, obviously governments, politicians, political parties, public relations agencies, all of these have some impact. But of course, what the advantage journalists have in this game, if we can think of it as a game, they referee the game. They make the final calls as to who or what counts toward the score. And so within that context, there has developed an area of agenda setting of particular interest to those of us in schools of journalism that we call intermedia agenda setting, the influence of one news medium on another. In most societies, you can kind of think of a status organization system within media, that some media are more prestigious than other media, and they influence other media. In the United States, the New York Times plays a central role in that regard. It is most frequently the agenda setter for new issues on the agenda or the way that issues are particularly framed or talked about. So intermedia agenda setting is a particularly rich area to think about. The other reason, as I remarked in an interview earlier this afternoon with a newspaper here in Ljubljana, why does this occur? Because journalists, and I was a journalist a long time ago, journalists are great plagiarists. They look to see what other journalists are doing, and they tend to do very, very similar things. And to kind of give you an example of that that's also very much intermedia agenda setting, there's an interesting book looking at, over a period of about 15 years, the competition between the two major newspapers in Buenos Aires, Argentina. The conclusion of the book is that the agendas were always fairly closely aligned. They're even more closely aligned now that both newspapers both publish and have an online presence than they were in the past. Because if you go into the newsroom of either one, there are two large screens on the wall. Our website, their website. It becomes very easy to monitor what stories the other paper is playing and how they're playing those stories. So that's the fifth area, intermedia agenda setting. Just a quick point on current research trends that are building on those particular areas of the theory. And here I borrow from physics, but not complicated physics. This is high school physics. And I call these the centrifugal trends and the centripetal trend. The centrifugal trend, of course, is a force that expands outwards, a thrust outward. A simple example of that, of course, is agenda setting has, of course, moved across the new media landscape to see if these media have agenda setting effects. And as I said a few minutes ago, of course they do. They look very similar to traditional media. But agenda setting has also moved into entirely new areas, far beyond the original domain of public affairs. Two quick examples. A former colleague at the University of Texas wrote a book on the history of the National Basketball Association, and he used agenda setting theory as his framework because he said the entire strategy of the NBA, not just their media strategy, their entire marketing strategy, was to get basketball, professional basketball, on the national sports agenda, and then by now the international sports agenda. At the time John Fortunato opens his history of the NBA, it was a minor league professional sport in the United States with a total income in the league from all sources of about $90 million a year. The year his book was published, the NBA signed a 5-year television contract for $2 billion. So they succeeded in setting the sports agenda. My other example is even totally remote from media. Two young Israeli scholars explicitly used agenda-setting theory to talk about a ritual in Jewish religious practice in the 19th century in Central Europe, which was a means of setting the community agenda. And a study that most of us in agenda-setting research do not regularly read. The study was published in the Journal of Rabbinic Studies. So a lot of interesting new agenda-setting studies going far beyond the original domain. And then finally, the centripetal trend. This is moving inward. Here, scholars are returning to the original concepts and further expanding them. So first and second level is now being expanded into third level. Some of the work on the psychology of agenda setting is being further elaborated as to what are the psychological processes excuse me, that underlie the agenda setting process. I think with that kind of preface, I'll turn it over to Craig Carroll now to talk about particularly the interesting and useful applications that have been made in corporate communication. Craig?
The first thing I'd like to do is just draw attention. We're going to work together here and just play off of each other. But one of these extensions here in agenda setting is looking at the application of organizations. And one of the first aspects that we found was that there was a tremendous amount of growth in the area of business news, just as there was in sports news, as you just heard about with Fortunato's study of the National Basketball Association. So one of the things in my first observations of looking at this particular space was ever since the creation of the business news section of the New York Times in 1981, that there's been a dramatic growth in interest in business news that carried on through the 90s with the .com and the creation of internet websites, where you have websites such as CNN, Hoovers.com, where they're collecting background information on companies and organizations. And so in just analyzing the observations, this particular graph here just illustrates the amount of news coverage taken from a number of editorial pieces, opinion pieces from a number of newspapers across the United States over a 25-year period, and you can see how much it has grown from 1980 through, at this particular time, we end it with the collapse of Enron. And so those are the two time periods that we look at, the introduction of the business news section of the New York Times through the collapse of Enron. And you can see that in terms of objects, that there's an incredible amount of growth in terms of the visibility of a wide range of organizations, where in the early 1980s, there was just a few organizations that managed to make it onto the front page or into the letters to the editor or into the editorial pages of major news organizations. But by the 1990s, there was just an incredible space for more faces. Now, what I'd like to draw attention to is just why this is so important, and for thinking about the growth of business news coverage and this incredible space that has opened up for organizations from an agenda-setting perspective. The first is that many times organizations have to go through the media for getting their messages out there, or they're going to have to speak for themselves. Certainly they can use third parties, but the two primary means that we've looked at in the past have been through journalism, through news organizations, or organizations through their advertising. However, people generally trust the news media more than they trust companies themselves. And there have been a variety of polls taken, around the world in this particular area. And one of the interesting dynamics now is the question of the degree of confidence that people have in institutions in general. And then there's just this tension between situations where people trust the media more and situations where they trust companies more. So it's not just a situation where it transfers across all areas, but it raises an interesting question about when it applies. The third is that in this incredible space where we now have the internet and we have social media, that organizations are now finding opportunities and the need for speaking out to defend themselves whenever they see something that's published or said about them in some particular way that would count as defamation. And from a legal perspective, it's interesting to think of what the courts are having to say about this particular area from a reputational perspective. And what we found in the United States is that when they have talked to judges, when they've talked to reporters, when they've talked to the general public, is that every group has its own standards of what defamation is and at what point has the news media affected the reputation of organizations. Organizations have their own view about when defamation has occurred, and it's just interesting to think that all three groups, the courts, the news media, and the publics, all have different definitions of what the level and threshold is for defamation to occur. The fourth is that from an evaluation perspective, for people who are interested in evaluating campaigns of organizations, they rely on news coverage and press clippings in particular for evaluating the success or failure of organizations' efforts. And so the news media becomes one way that public relations and corporate communications executives can return back to the leadership of their organizations to provide some kind of benchmark in terms of their contribution to organizations. But it's also an opportunity for them to monitor what's going on in the world of their competitors. There's also the issue of then, if we can monitor reputations through the news media, there's also the question of if we can connect this to financial performance. And there have been some studies in Canada to actually show that, yes, based on your reputation through the news media, that it can actually relate to your financial performance as an organization. Now, one of the things I've just mentioned is that, organizations are actually using the news media as a proxy for their for reputations, but it's not to suggest that all news articles are equal. Now, when we first began this particular area, and again, the original observation was just simply looking at the transformation and growth of news coverage from the introduction of the New York Times in business section in 1981 as its own unique section, through the collapse of Enron with the volume of news material produced about that single organization. Professor McCombs and I had the opportunity to extrapolate and begin thinking about what this meant from an agenda setting perspective. And so the original piece that we put together in thinking about this is now 10 years old, and we put together a number of objects, many of that you will recognize here. We put together a number of hypotheses that you'll recognize here that looks at the transfer of salience for objects, attributes, and attributes of objects. So I'm just going to go through a few of them here in a moment. But what I would point out is that Slovenia actually played a major role in the replication of the original study here. So Professor Vrčić and Professor Podner both were part of a team where we looked at the replication of these ideas in 26 countries around the world. This was a study that was funded by the University of Cambridge, the Judge Business School, where they provided us the opportunity of matching professors of journalism with professors of business together. I use the example that it's almost like peanut butter and chocolate meeting together for Reese's peanut butter cups for the first time. But in Slovenia, you were fortunate enough to have two people among the faculty right here in the same school that had sufficient background from an agenda setting perspective to work together, which carried us a long way in terms of the advance of the particular project. Now, in thinking about the original framework here, well, what I want to point out is that we've now got 10 years to look back on what has been written in this particular area. And so what I want to do is I want to hit some of the high points of what has occurred in the past 10 years of empirical investigation and the research. The first is that we have in general treated the second level of agenda setting, both levels the same. There's an affective level, which looks at the emotional appeal, and the cognitive level, which in the world of organizations concerns corporate social responsibility, financial performance, executive leadership, innovation, ethics, a variety of other attributes. And in general, we've kind of treated those as the same. We've also primarily only looked at from the perspective of one organization, and that is in the sense of how, for the construction of one organization's reputation, CSR plays a role, innovation plays a role, the reputation of the CEO plays a role, but we've not really considered the concept of objects within attributes, and so I'm going to introduce that here in a moment. The third is that we found that in reviewing the work that's been done, we've primarily focused on the mainstream news media and in terms of how organizations are portrayed through the mainstream press. A couple of studies, and I'll mention Slovenia in particular. The study that was done here looked at not only the general public, but also the business public as well. So that was one of the first places we had for kind of stepping out and considering two different audiences. But in terms of the media, most of the studies in the past that have looked at reputation have primarily focused on the mainstream media. And we now have the opportunity for reflecting on social media and stakeholder media as well. So we'll talk a little bit about that briefly. And looking back on it, I think the 15 to 20 years where the second level of agenda setting was most salient, we usually conceptualized or framed the discussion around how objects had attributes. We could also think of those attributes as objects where they also have attributes. Those attributes have their own attributes. So as a result, we could think of it from the perspective of a microscope where we focus on one attribute and get more focused and more focused and see a variety of other mini attributes within those. And so we frame this in order to keep the conversation conceptual and understandable, is that it's a continuum. We've talked about it as a continuum of macro attributes to micro attributes as a way of keeping the conversation focused without going on and on and on. And at what point does the telescope, do you need a more specific lens? And I guess in terms of ending the conversation, or where we're beginning with the work of organizations, is that the original set of studies made no distinction between attributes and associations. And we're now finding that it's very useful in the world of organizations and corporate communication to distinguish between attributes and associations. And the fifth point I want to point out, and this is very helpful for those working in corporate communications and public relations, is that we need to think about it from a strategic perspective about how all this fits together. And so what I'm going to leave you with is the idea that up to this point, it's just been a variety of strands of research, and we need to put it together in terms of a coherent story. And the basic story that we would like to suggest to you in terms of how this all fits together is that both media salience and corporate reputation are multidimensional concepts. And so I'm going to unpack this a little bit more here. And so in terms of looking at why we in corporate communications might study media salience and the effects of the media on organizations, we can think about it in a variety of perspectives. And this is important. I think it's where the work and agenda setting applied to organizations really clicked and took on, and people began to understand the connections, is to realize that the first generation of research that occurred on corporate reputation basically said there wasn't much of an effect, or it was, some studies said there was a negative effect. And so what we found from looking at those studies on corporate reputation was that they were looking at the volume of news reports and relating it to reputation as a unidimensional variable, okay? So in other words, just appearing in the news media affected an organization's reputation. And that's a very simplistic process of thinking about it and not very helpful for organizations that are concerned about evaluating their reputations. So what we found is that from an agenda setting perspective, the basic story is that it's important to match the dimensions of agenda setting, the different levels, okay, of media salience to different levels of salience within the public, okay? So the first idea is basically that media visibility, the volume of news reports that your organization receives in the news media, relates to the degree of top-of-mind awareness or the degree of prominence, okay? In other words, for your organization to have a reputation in the news media, you must be first thought about, okay? Right? So they must first occur in the press. Before we can think about attributes of organizations, we must first be thinking about those organizations. The second is that from the second level perspective, we're concerned about the degree that both tone as a measure of favorability and the evaluative dimension of the second level, and also the cognitive topics as the cognitive dimension of corporate reputation, both relate. And then where we're going to go further and kind of leaving the door by the time we finish tonight is that there are media associations that affect the corporate associations that people form. So let's just look at it quickly in terms of some of the empirical evidence. In the United States, the original study, we looked at how the top-of-mind awareness was a result of the degree of media salience, and which we call the volume of news reports. Okay, so we controlled for the advertising, okay, which is important for those in public relations to know how much your expenditures affect your visibility in the press. And then we controlled for the organization's existing reputation. Then I'll mention here that we also had some empirical evidence from a variety of countries, Denmark, Finland, France, here in Slovenia, and Spain, that basically found the same basic effect. And I'll just point out from the study here, what was unique about the study that was done in Slovenia was that it was one of the few studies where they looked at both types of audiences, the general public and the business public, and they found that there was a relationship there. The second was in terms of media favorability and esteem. Okay, so when we think about esteem, what we're talking about is the degree to which organizations are liked, trusted, respected, admired, and held in positive regard. And as we think about the work that's now occurred over 10 years, there's a concern from a public relations or a corporate communications perspective about the amount of money that you spend in terms of evaluating the success of your efforts and the amount of work and energy that's spent in building relationships with the media. And because of that, sometimes they're concerned about using human coders, which is fairly labor-intensive, and there's a strong desire for using automated processes and using computers. And there's also a question about the degree of reliability when you're using computers for evaluating your reputation in the news media. Well, we found that there are computer programs out there that can be used for assessing corporate reputation, particularly the dimension of public esteem, the degree that companies are liked, trusted, respected, and admired. And we call that dimension peripheral media favorability. So here's how that works. Focal media favorability is concerned with how one person evaluates your organization in the press. Okay? From an evaluation perspective, it means that your agencies are looking at specifically how your organization is portrayed. They get the clips, they go straight to the paragraphs where your organization is mentioned, and they look specifically at the tone of those specific organizations. Now, that's meaningful. It's also very expensive data to collect. And some organizations sometimes prefer automated processes, which is where we found that the concept of peripheral media favorability was also a useful concept. Now, peripheral media favorability differs dramatically from focal media favorability in the sense that it's primarily concerned with the overall evaluative tone of the news articles themselves, independent of how the organizations are portrayed. Okay? Now, that's a little surprising. It's basically like saying for one news article where IBM and Microsoft are both mentioned, they both get coded the same way, even though IBM might be portrayed positively and Microsoft might be portrayed negatively. How could they have the same media evaluation score? Well, if the media evaluation score is based on the tone of the overall news article, independent of how those two organizations are portrayed, that's how it would happen. And so what we found is that there is this effect where the general tone of the news article can actually wash over the evaluations of specific organizations. Now, for someone who knows your organization, that probably wouldn't happen very much. They're reading the news clips, they're focused on IBM, they're focused on Microsoft, they're focused on Lenovo, and they know how to discount the general tone of the overall news report and focus only on the tone specifically directed about Microsoft, IBM, or Lenovo. But we found that for the general public who had very limited knowledge of these organizations and were generally keeping up with the news reports as the source of the events of the day and really didn't care much about the organizations that were portrayed within those news articles, that there was this passive effect in the sense that it's the tone washing over them. They're paying attention to the general gist of things that occur in a stream of articles, and their exposure to those organizations is secondary and peripheral to the general topic and the general tone of those news articles. So, the reason why this is important is it's to suggest that for publics and for audiences that your organization may not have an existing relationship at that particular moment, that there's particular audiences where you do depend on the news media for reaching these groups, that the general tone of your news coverage matters for those particular people, and it may be important for reaching particular audiences that you are not yet reaching at the moment. Now, we've also found some general evidence to support this idea in a variety of countries. Denmark looked at the image rankings for the 10 most prominent organizations in their country. Italy found that it primarily existed more for positive coverage. In Argentina, they found that they had differential effects depending on the size of the organization, and that small to medium-sized enterprises were generally portrayed more positive regardless of the topic, where multinationals were generally portrayed more negative. In Finland, we found that the general tone was neutral, but when there was positive coverage, it was primarily directed towards Finnish organizations, and non-Finnish organizations were generally portrayed less positively. And of course, there were some countries where, for a variety of reasons, that the effects were not as significant to non-existent. For example, in China. Now, in terms of looking at the media topics, right, the degree that your organization has coverage about CSR or about your products or about financial performance. Most of the work has primarily looked at isolated attributes in the past, and we're now finding that that might not be the most useful way. So in the early studies, we found that, okay, there is an agenda-setting effect for some attributes, but not for other attributes, and it's raised the question of under what conditions might it affect when certain attributes are more salient than others. So what we've discovered from using agenda-setting theory, looking at, I guess you could say, even the psychological level of, the question of need for orientation, is that certain attributes are more salient in the press, okay, and more salient for the public when they're abstract in nature, and it's not something that the public can generally observe on their own. So, corporate social responsibility, innovation is fairly broad, ambiguous abstracts that people are interested in, okay? They're going to depend on the news media for those particular attributes. But there are other attributes where there's, for example, products and services, where there's a retail presence, maybe people own those products. They don't necessarily depend on the news coverage for information about those organizations because they can get them in other ways. So just kind of summarizing where things are in the past, for the past 10 years, we've done a lot of work in terms of the relationship between media visibility and prominence. We've established a pretty strong relationship between media favorability and public esteem. And we certainly need more work in the area of media attributes and media associations. But before we go down that road, Professor McCombs is going to explain a little bit more about how these media associations work.
Thank you, Craig. Just a few minutes here at the end about what we're now calling the third level of agenda setting effects. The core proposition of agenda setting, as we've known it for 45 years now, is that an element that is prominent in the media becomes prominent in the minds of the public. And as Craig remarked, a good choice of words a minute ago, we tend to look at these in isolation. How frequently is this issue in the news? How frequently is that attribute in the news? And to the extent that we connect these units with each other, it's simply by their relative prominence in terms of how frequently they appear there. But in effect, we have taken apart the media messages, and to the extent we have, for instance, open-ended questions like, what would you tell a friend? We've taken apart those messages to pull out the particular attributes or objects that are being talked about. But in the news and people's comments, these objects and attributes are bundled together. They're not disaggregated. When people answer the question, what would you tell a friend about? They typically name a series of attributes of this person. That is, they construct a small image. And so the third level better fits Walter Lippmann's notion of the pictures in our heads. Many of you will recall that Walter Lippmann, in his book Public Opinion, published back in 1922, is, I always say, the intellectual father of agenda setting. Lippmann's book Public Opinion began with a chapter titled The World Outside and the Pictures in Our Heads. And his thesis was that the media, the news media, are the bridge between the two. No one did very much with that, particularly in a quantitative way, for nearly 50 years, until the Chapel Hill study. Don Shaw and I said, let's see if we can measure that linkage between how the media portray the world outside and the pictures in people's heads. Well, the first level of agenda setting, the salience of objects, kind of says, what are these pictures about? The second level the agenda of attributes is, well, what are some of the key characteristics of this picture? The third level is moving closer to saying, what is the picture? Because we're asking, to what extent, for example, are the attributes of an object linked to each other? Not just which one was more frequent, which was second, which was third. How are they actually linked to each other? And we can ask the same question, of course, of objects. And so we've applied the technique of network analysis to see what are the co-occurrences of, for example, attributes. And I'll give you just one quick example. Rather than collecting new data where we had no idea what even traditional attribute agenda setting effects might look like, we went back to an election study that Ki-Han Kim and I had done in Texas, where there were two major offices up in the election, a governor of the state with two major candidates vying for that office, and a seat in the U.S. Senate, again, two candidates vying for that seat. We looked at how the news media in Austin, Texas, the capital of the state, described these four men. We looked at how the voters in our survey answered that, what would you tell a friend about each of these men? And it didn't really matter whether we did the four candidates separately or just each office separately, or if we put all four together, the answers were essentially the same. And the first number you see there, 0.65, was a traditional attribute agenda setting analysis, an attribute agenda setting effect, and a fairly substantial one. Our question in this first network agenda setting study was, what if we actually look at how these attributes are bundled together in the press coverage and how we look at them bundled together in the minds of the public? And we found a very, very similar correlation, but we also found a much more qualitatively satisfying picture of what these attribute agendas look like in the media and what they look like among members of the public. This is the media attribute agenda, and you can see the little blue squares are the attributes, nodes in the language of network analysis. The lines show the degree of connection between these attributes or nodes in news coverage and in people's comments. The darker the line, the more frequently they co-occur together in the news coverage, which is what we're looking at here. Well, you can see there is a tight core, and leadership and experience are the dominant attributes in the core. They are more connected to all the other attributes than any others, whereas morality and leadership are out here on the left at the bottom, interestingly, rather weakly connected to each other. That is, they don't occur very often together. Both are heavily connected to the core attributes in the way the media talked about these four political figures. This is the public's attribute agenda, which again you can see a tight core, and again it's leadership and experience. They are the most central of the attributes in the way the public talks about these men. They at various times have other attributes connected, and again leadership and morality are out there on the periphery with a very modest connection between them. So it begins to give us a better idea of what the picture really is. When people talk about political candidates, or when journalists talk about political candidates, what's in the core? And the core is not always the most frequent, but it's the most frequently connected to the entire network of attributes. I won't go through the methodology for this next study because I know it's getting late, but we've applied the same kind of analysis to sets of issues that you can think of, a network of issues that are out there at any given time that are appearing in the news at the same time, and that when we ask people what's the most important issue, and particularly if we allow them to give multiple responses to the question, these are the issues that are appearing simultaneously that in that sense are co-occurring. We've begun to apply, these are literally the first two studies that have been done in this area. We have a whole series of other projects underway at this time, but that's an entirely different lecture. I think at this point we'll close and leave some time for questions. Thank you very much.